If you want to find animals, you've got to understand where they're going and why. Thankfully, their routes are a lot less random than you might expect. Hey guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Last week, I did an episode on scouting, talking about what it is, how it's done, and what to look for. And as I was thinking about that podcast, I realized I needed to do a follow-up and talk about animal movement, which is what we're going to get into today. The scouting episode will help you find a good general area to hunt, and this episode will help you hone it in even further. So today we'll talk about why animal movement is important, the predictable ways in which animals move, how they choose their routes, and how to apply this information to actually intersect and kill animals. Before we start, if you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to follow it on whatever platform you listen on and share an episode with a friend. There are so many people out there who are interested in hunting, but they don't know where to start, and I want to reach all of them. So help me out, share an episode with someone you know, and we will help more people get outside and into hunting and ready for the next season. First, I want to talk about why animal movement is important. Why would we spend a whole episode talking about it? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, movement helps us spot animals. A moving animal is much easier to see and to locate. Think about if you found the perfect place to hunt. It had food, shelter, and water, and you had even hiked around and bumped some of the animals that you wanted to hunt. Well, let's say those animals just hung up in the shelter and were stock still. It would be very hard to locate them. You might walk around and bump them, but even when you bumped them, they would probably run away quickly before you had chance to react. So a still animal is hard to detect, and that's one of the main ways that they stay out of danger. But once they start to move, as a hunter, it's a lot easier to locate them. The other way hunters use animal movement is to predict the routes that animals are going to take. And when you can predict where the animals are going to go, then you can set up and intersect them and ambush them. So animal movement is very important because it gives hunters an advantage when usually the cards are stacked against us. Now, animal movement can seem pretty random. If you're out in the woods and you see animals someplace, you might have no idea why they're there. But there are actually some predictable ways in which animals move. There are three predictable patterns that we're going to talk about today. Daily movement patterns, which are prompted by hunger and a need for shelter. Weather can also play a big role in this. Rutting season movements, so when animals are looking for mates and driven by testosterone. And then also seasonal or even migrational patterns, where animals are following the food and avoiding snow or heat to stay comfortable. So if you understand why animals are moving in these three scenarios, you will better be able to predict where they are going to go and actually set up to kill them. We're going to start by talking about daily movement patterns. Animals have daily needs. Just like people, animals need food, shelter, and water. And so throughout the day, they are going to be moving to these different things. Likely, there's going to be a difference between where their food is and where their shelter is, or where their shelter is and where their water is. And throughout the day, they will be moving accordingly. Now, one important detail to know about daily movement patterns is that most North American game animals are active in the twilight hours. So the word for that is crepuscular, and it just means they're most active during the low light hours of the day, the early mornings and the late evenings. And a common pattern among game animals like your elk and deer, and then also bears to some extent, is that animals will bed during the day and then feed usually in the evening and through the night and into the early morning. At night, they might bed down near their food source or in their food source. So they're not just feeding constantly throughout the night all the time, but often they get into this pattern where they bed down, they basically hide during the day and rest. Then towards the evening, they will go to their food source. They'll eat as it starts to get dark. By morning, they will get up before light and they might eat some more, and then they will head back to wherever they were bedding. And so they get into this pattern of going from bed to feed, feed to bed. And they do this for a couple reasons. During the day, they're hiding from predators, namely humans, right? And then they're also managing their temperature and trying to stay comfortable, especially in the summer or the early fall when it's still warm during the day and they're walking around with these big heavy coats. They're trying to find some place where they can go and be shaded and conserve their energy. If you think about it, most animals do this. There's not many animals out during the heat of the day. And it's always funny to me to think about humans because people just love going to the beach like right around 1 o'clock and they'll just get burned. Like I've done this before, but that seems to be people's favorite time. And almost no animals are out during the heat of the day because it just doesn't make sense. And personally, I don't think humans should be out during the heat of the day either. But to each his own, you can do whatever you want. So all this to say, animals are going to be most active during the early mornings and the late evenings. And this is also going to be the best time to see animals because if they're up on their feet and they're moving, you're more likely to spot them or run into them. So that's super important. It kind of sets the context for these patterns that we're going to talk about. So let's start with the evening movement pattern. It's the bed to food pattern. Like I said, animals are going to be getting up out of their day beds and heading to a food source. And their day beds are going to be somewhere secure. Often this is going to be in thick cover. They are going to bed with the wind in their favor, and they are going to have some escape routes. So this makes it very hard to walk up on them and kill them. Even if you walked into their bed, they will likely smell you or hear you long before you reach them, and they'll be able to escape. And that's part of what makes it secure. Also, during the summer, it's going to be somewhere that has some temperature regulation. It might be in a cool, dark forest, might be near water, something like that, to help them stay cool. Now, their food source is going to be something different. Often it's going to be a field, maybe it's a clear cut, maybe it's a mast source, so a source of nuts or fruits or berries. And then sometimes it might just be an exposed slope where grass can grow or where plants can grow and get some sun. So a very common example of this is a south-facing slope. These slopes tend to get more sun, hold a little less snow, and therefore plants can grow even during times of year when there's not much food around. And like I said, they are going to get up from their day beds and head out to feed in the evening to avoid predators. Now, the main predators for animals during hunting season are humans. And so a lot of their patterns, their daily patterns, are going to be revolving around human pressure. But it can also be to avoid other predators. Elk, for example, tend to feed in open areas in the evening because it gets them away from some of the mountain lions that like to hunt in the thick wooded country. And then during the day, the mountain lions are a little less active. They can go into the thick wooded country and bed down. And it's just a way for them to kind of manage their predator exposure. However, when humans aren't in the mix, animals are going to be more likely to be out during the day because they know they're not going to get shot. So these patterns are especially galvanized during the hunting season. So if you understand that every day animals are likely to go from their daytime bedding area to their food source, you now have a great way to predict where they are going to be. Not only where they're going to be, but possibly predict their travel route in between these two things. And that's a great place to set up and actually hunt them. And we'll talk about applying all this a little bit more later in the podcast. The second daily pattern is the reverse, right? So we had bed to food. Now in the mornings, animals are going to go from their food source to their bedding. So they may feed through the night, or they may bed in or near their food source, and then they need to go somewhere else that is less exposed and more sheltered for the day. So often food sources are going to be a place where there is a break in the timber, right? Like a clear cut or a field, someplace where sunlight can hit the ground and grow plants. But those places are also very exposed. Animals don't want to just be out in the middle of this in the broad daylight because it means that they could get attacked or shot by hunters. Now, in some places, you have wide open spaces like high desert climates. I just think of that all the time because of central Washington, where I've hunted before. Some places are going to be wide open, right? And animals use their senses, their sense of smell and also sight to be able to avoid predators at long distances. But there are a lot of animals like white-tailed deer, for example, that once that hunting pressure kicks in, they're going to stick to the thick cover and they're not going to be out in the open as much to avoid getting shot. So if they're on a food source that is in the wide open, as the sun comes up, they're going to start thinking about a place to go bed down and stay safe throughout the day. So in the evenings, you've got the bed to food. In the mornings, you've got the food to bed. And once again, if you know where their food is and you know where their bed is, you can think about where to cut them off in between and actually kill them. One thing that can change daily movement patterns is the weather. Sometimes you might hear hunters talk about a cold front, or the weather getting colder and making the animals move more. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One is that when it gets colder, animals need more calories. So as the snow comes in and as the temperatures drop, they just need more food, and food becomes more scarce. And so they have to spend more time searching for food and eating just to survive. And when this happens, you're more likely to see animals out during the day feeding because they just need to eat and they can't afford to go and bed down somewhere. Also, animals are very sensitive to the weather. So they can probably sense barometric pressure and they can tell when a storm is coming in. And they don't want to be up on their feet during a rainstorm or during a snowstorm. They'd rather be bedded down. And so when you have something like a cold front rolling in, they can sense it and they will likely prepare by going somewhere to eat. Or if they've been bedded down for a long time in a rainstorm or a snowstorm, likely when that storm breaks, they might get up on their feet and go find somewhere to feed. So the weather can play a big role in animal movement, and it may disrupt their normal food to bed, bed to food patterns. However, for a hunter, if you know this weather pattern is approaching, it may be a good time for you to get out in the woods. Or if you have been experiencing rain in your hunting area for a while, but you see that it's going to clear up one day, that would be a great time to go out and get in the woods because it's likely that animals will be on their feet. While daily movement patterns can be highly predictable, rut movement patterns and rutting behavior can seem much more random. However, we do understand two things. One, we usually know when it's going to happen, or at least the a window or time frame in which rutting behavior is going to occur. And we know what the animals are trying to do. So we can use these things to actually help us kill animals and narrow down where they might be, even though the rutting movement can be sporadic and crazy. So during the rut, males are trying to find females to mate with. And the males typically cover a lot of ground and will often be on their feet during the day. If you know any deer hunters, most deer hunters love November because November is usually when white-tailed deer rut. And during this time of year, you're more likely to see a white-tailed buck than just about any other time of year. And that's because white-tailed bucks can be very cagey. They keep to themselves throughout most of the year. But during rutting season, they're all pumped up on testosterone, and they will be running around all throughout the day, all throughout the night, looking for mates. And so as hunters, we can take advantage of this movement to kill animals. The first thing you need to know about rutting movement is when the rut is likely to occur. So for elk, the rut typically occurs in September. For deer, it typically occurs in mid-November. And for bears, it typically occurs in late May, early June. And this can change depending on the location and the weather and different factors. You know, it may happen a little bit sooner or a little bit later, but if you're hunting in the same area year after year, usually the rut is going to happen around the same time annually. You could even think about the turkey rut. It's not usually called a rut, but when turkeys are trying to mate, that's usually going to be in April or early May. The second thing you need to know about rutting movement is how animals find each other. So some animals are very vocal. With elk, the male elk will bugle and make this crazy, loud, high-pitched noise, and other animals can hear that and know exactly where that bull is, right? The cows can hear that and they know exactly where that bull is. Deer tend to be less vocal, but during the rutting season, bucks will run these routes trying to scent check does. So basically, they're covering large areas, trying to go downwind of where they think does will be bedding. And then if they smell does in those areas, they can tell if there's a doe in heat and if they have a chance of mating with them. And so animals will employ different strategies. They may employ a combination, but if you're trying to kill an elk during rutting season, you could use a cow call and call in a bull elk. Or if you're trying to kill a deer during the rut, you could think about where the does are going to be bedded throughout the day and then set up downwind of those areas. Or if you find a lot of does, you know that the bucks are going to be looking for those does, right? And so you might want to set up in that area instead of somewhere else. So knowing these things about the rut can help you make a decision on where to actually hunt. A third type of predictable animal movement is migrational or seasonal movement. And I'm just going to start this one with an example. So bears in the winter will choose a place to den. And typically they like to go to higher elevations, places that will get nice and covered by snow, and they sleep all through the winter. Then when spring comes around, the snow starts melting, the bears start waking up, and they're typically at these higher elevations. But there might not be a lot of food around them, so they have to start going down the mountain to find some food. Well, then throughout the spring, the snow starts to melt. And as the snow melts, at each higher elevation, new green up follows the snow line. So green up just being fresh grasses and fresh plants. So the bear will follow the snow line going back up the mountain, right? Just following the food. Then, when all the snow melts, some things are going to happen. Well, on the mountain, some of the green up is going to not have water anymore and it's going to go dry. And so at that point, the only places where a bear can get food are either in these high meadows that have recently had snow melt or still have some sort of water source feeding them, or they're going to go down the mountain into places that have water down in the valleys. And at this point, food is more abundant. They can probably get it from many different sources, but they're still going to key into the most productive food sources. So as the fall rolls around, the most productive food sources are likely going to be mast crops like acorns and fruits and berries. And so the bears key into the huckleberries, let's say, and so they're going back up the mountain, right? And the huckleberries ripen at lower elevations first and then continue to ripen at higher elevations throughout the season. So the bears are following the ripe huckleberries back up the mountain. All of this to say, bears could be in very different places throughout the year and throughout the hunting seasons. If you're hunting for fall bears and you're looking for them in the places that you were hunting spring bears, you might not find them. Or if you're scouting for bears and you find them in one place and then you come back 3 weeks later, they could be in a completely different place. So all of that is to illustrate the seasonal patterns that animals can fall into. They're going to be following the food. They're going to be trying to stay either warm or stay cool. You know, when snow comes in the winter, it often pushes animals down to lower elevations because it's harder to find food. And this can be very helpful for concentrating animals and finding them as a hunter. Some animals are more migratory than others. So some animals will have very small home ranges. Sometimes you hear about deer having tiny home ranges where it's only a square mile, whereas other animals could have huge home ranges or even be migrational. So if you think of ducks, for example, obviously ducks fly south for the winter. And so if you tried to hunt ducks in, late winter, they're just not going to be there because they've flown south. It could be the same thing with an elk herd in your area. Maybe where you live, it isn't a great place for elk to overwinter. And come winter, they head off somewhere else. So these are things that you need to key into, and you need to understand where the animals are going to be during your season. And then if there's something weird about the year, maybe there's low moisture or there's more snow than normal, something just strange, something deviant, then that could affect where the animals are during your hunting season as well. So it's going to be different depending on the animal and where you live. The best thing is just to talk to some locals, talk to the game wardens, do some scouting, and find out where the animals are going to be during your season. All right, so we've got an understanding of why animals move. The next thing to know is that they choose their routes very particularly. So if they need to get from point A to point B, they're not just going to go anywhere. Often they're looking for something specific. So their routes are often determined by a couple of different factors, and we're going to talk about 3 of them. So the first one is wind and thermals. The second one is finding the easiest route possible. And the third one is finding a route that is more concealed and less dangerous. So let's start with wind and thermals. When possible, animals are going to travel into the wind or in a direction where the wind is advantageous to them. And I'm talking about big game animals like elk and deer and bears. All of these animals have highly developed senses of smell. And if the wind is in their favor, they are going to be able to detect threats long before they can be attacked. So if you know this preference, you can actually think about what the most advantageous route for an animal would be with the prevailing winds. Now, thermals kind of make this confusing because thermals change throughout the day. So a simple explanation of thermals is that the sun heats the earth and the earth heats the air, causing air to rise. And then when the sun goes down in the evenings, the sun is no longer heating the earth and the earth is no longer heating the air. So the current of airflow switches and the air actually falls. And there's a natural rhythm to this throughout the day. Typically in the late morning or midday, the thermals are going to be rising. And typically as the sun goes down, the thermals will switch and fall. Now, it gets a lot more complicated when you have varied topography. You have places where thermals can swirl and the wind can travel in different directions than you might expect. And the varied topography can play a big role in that. However, if you understand sort of the prevailing wind in the area that you hunt and you understand when the thermals are going to switch, you can then start to think about the most advantageous travel routes for the animal. And this can be as detailed as helping you understand where a deer is going to enter a field. If you know there's a prevailing wind going east to west across this field, it's likely that the deer is going to come in from the west side because they can smell any threats in front of them. So that's a simple explanation. It can get a little more complicated, but you always want to keep the wind direction and thermals in mind. Now, on top of that, animals are typically going to choose the easiest route. Just like people like trails to walk on, animals do too. Now, they won't always use the easiest route because maybe there's hunting pressure and the easiest route is the most dangerous route. But when they can, they're going to use features like ridges, saddles, valleys, benches, and different places that have a shallower slope to travel. So say you've identified a food source and you've identified shelter, but there's a pretty significant ridge in between them. Well, if you can find a saddle in that ridge, there's a good chance that animals are going to be traveling through that saddle daily to get between that shelter and that food source, or that bedding cover and that food source. Or say you're in steep country and there's a little finger ridge that goes down to the bottom of the valley. Well, any animals that are in the bottom of the valley, instead of going just straight up the side of the canyon, are going to use that finger ridge instead to get to a main ridge. And so that might be a good place to hunt. So when you're trying to narrow down where the animals are actually going to be, always think about what would be the easiest route for them and start there. And then finally, when animals are choosing their routes, they're likely going to choose a safe route if possible. So one example of this is in agricultural country where you have these big, wide open cut fields, and then you have these little blocks of timber. And during hunting season in pressured areas, you're rarely going to see deer walk straight through an open field. Sure, it might be an easy point A to point B travel route, but it would be super exposed and they could get shot. So what you'll start to find is that deer will walk just inside the timber around the edges of these fields. And that way they can stay concealed from anybody who's watching the field. So animals are often going to do this, where they're going to choose a more concealed route than maybe the obvious one in the wide open. All right, so we know that animals move in predictable ways, and we have some idea of what routes they are going to take. Let's talk about putting it all together. So one of the first things you should take away from this is that you need to hunt at the best time of day. And typically this is going to be early morning or late evening. I've told this story before, but when I first started hunting deer, I would often leave around 4:30. So I would get up early in the morning, I would go out and hunt, then I would hunt all throughout the day during the least productive time of the day, the middle of the day. And then I would head home around 4:30 because I didn't know what to do if I killed a buck near dark. Well, I missed out on a lot of good hunting opportunities because likely right about the time I was leaving, the animals were just getting active. So if you want to increase your chances of success, you need to hunt at the right times of day. Now, there is one time of year when the midday might be productive, and that's during the rut. That's when animals are up on their feet and looking for mates, and there may be a chance that you're going to run into an animal in the middle of the day. And all that to say, it's not that you can't kill animals during the middle of the day. It's just that if you want to give yourself the best chances of catching an animal on their feet, it's likely going to be in the morning or evening. The next thing you can do with this information is pattern animals. So some animals, especially white-tailed deer, can get into daily patterns. And if it's not a daily pattern, it can be a weekly pattern or a 3-day pattern where they will go and bed and feed in the same places. So deer are notorious for this. They will day after day bed in the same place and then feed in the same place and do that bed to food, food to bed pattern over and over. And until the season changes or a hunter busts them out of their daily pattern, they could keep doing that indefinitely. Elk are known to have patterns, but likely they're going to be larger. So they might have a 3-day circuit where they bed someplace, then they go feed, then they bed another place, then they go feed. And eventually after 3 days, they're going to end up back in the same area where they started. So if you can observe animals and figure out their pattern, you put yourself at a huge advantage. And all you have to do is go out scouting, bring some binoculars, and just actually watch animals and see what they do. This can be large scale where you're just trying to get an idea of what area they're in and how commonly they go to those areas. It can also be very granular. Many white-tailed deer hunters will pattern a certain deer and they'll know exactly where he beds, exactly where he enters a field, and then they can set up near where that deer enters the field to get a chance to shoot him. And so you can do this too. You can use your scouting to find a bedding area and find a feeding area. Then you can go observe them. You can think about what the best route in between the bedding and the feeding area is, and then go set up on that route and get a chance to intercept and kill the animal you're after. And so that brings me to the third way you can use all of this information. If you find places where animals travel frequently, those are great places to set up. So say you're scouting and you find a great game trail that has lots of fresh sign and it seems to be used every day. Well, if you can set up on that game trail, likely an animal is going to come along, and it's just a matter of time that you can spend sitting there waiting. Or maybe you can find a pinch point. In ag country, a pinch point is going to be like the place where 2 blocks of timber connect. And it might just be the corners touching, but it's the only place in these big cut field areas where deer can walk between the 2 blocks of timber without being seen. So if you can go set up near that pinch point, likely animals are going to be traveling through there and you could get a shot at them. That's the same with saddles, right? Or river bottoms or water crossings. All these places funnel animal movement, and you should really be keen into these places when you're scouting. We talked about earlier, how animals are likely to use a concealed place to travel. So when you're hunting big open fields, you might consider hunting actually on the inside edge of a field in a place where either the animal can get out into the field concealed, or where the animal is traveling along the edge of the field right inside the timber. And so you'll have a lot less visibility because maybe you can't see across the field, but you will have a better chance at actually killing an animal that's walking along those field edges or trying to sneak into the field unsuspected. Food sources are also a great place that concentrate animals. And if you know of a good food source and you know likely where the animals are bedded, you can set up in between the bedding and the food source. Or in some cases, you can even set up on the food source. So when the animals come out and they're feeding, you could have a chance at getting a shot. So all of these things work together to help you start pinpointing where animals are actually going to be. And it's not just random. And I think I'm so excited about that because once you start to realize that animal movement is not just random and where animals are likely to be is not completely random, you actually have some agency to go out and hunt them in a calculated fashion. And once you start learning to do that, that's when I think hunting gets really fun and you will start to enjoy more success. All right, guys. Well, I hope this episode has been helpful for you and maybe it's shed some light on what you need to do to actually find animals. If you listened to this whole episode and you still haven't listened to the Scouting 101 episode from last week, go do that. I think there's a lot of great foundational information that this episode builds on. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment or message me on Instagram, and I will be happy to find you and answer. With that, I will wrap this up. I hope you have a great week, and I will catch you on the next one.